People simply didn't have the slightest idea of what was coming. Hi there. I've been reading this book, All Quiet on the Western Front, by Remarque. I'll get his full name. Eric Maria Remarque. It's everything I thought it would be, but more. I'd seen the films. The one that was John Boy in the Waltons, he did a version late 70s. There was a version, I think, made in the late 20s. And if I'm correct, there's one just recently. So this is a perennial favourite. And in the front, the first thing that's written is this book is intended neither as an accusation nor as a confession, but simply as an attempt to give an account of a generation that was destroyed by the war, even those of it who survived the shelling. It's not very long, but I'm taking my time reading it. I do anyway. I've got no choice on that. And rather than waiting till I finished it, there's so much in here that appeals to myself. I'm not sure if it appeals to anybody else. If you come regularly to the channel, this may not be of interest to you, but in the beginning, the first two chapters, what will strike you as you read it is that he's talking about the loss of innocence, that these men were very young, and in fact, I think they're in their early 20s. Yeah. So on page 13, none of us is more than 20, but young men, that was a long time ago. We are old now. So powerful in the little snippets that the author gives. And we must remember that this is from the Germans' point of view. And what it does, it humanizes what were considered to be the enemy from the English-speaking point of view and the French. And what's amazing, he talks about Company B, and they're all people that he slowly introduces to the reader. There's Kropp and Müller, Lear, Westhus, Dettering, and fourthly myself, Paul Baumer. So although the back talks about young unknown soldier, that's not the case. We know who he is. And you know it's about the First World War. And it starts very positively. They're just behind the enemy lines. In fact, they're 5 miles behind. And he states, "Our bellies are full of bully beef and beans. We haven't had a stroke of luck like this for ages." So they've been to the front. They've been brought back for rest, recuperation, recovery. One of them is seriously ill in hospital. I'll talk about him in a moment. And the normal quantity of food had been mistakenly already made before they arrived, but most of the company had been wiped out. So only 80 of us came back. That meant almost double portions for the survivors. There's this scene where the cooks are trying to get it back, and one of them effectively makes them agree not to. We are B Company. And so you get this false impression that the war, the First World War, that awful conflict and loss of men for very little amount of land, this meat grinder is going on and on and on. And as you continue, as you start to get into the book, so I got to the point where I decided to finish. I've just gone beyond slightly where I want to talk about here. And it's going to get dark. I can just tell that's coming. He also throws in a bit of humour. So they're there behind lines, they're having all this food, they're gorging themselves, and they need to go to the toilets, the thunder boxes as they call it. And that's an old medieval term, but you find it in English as well. The latrines. And he says, "I can still remember how embarrassed we were at the beginning, when we were recruits in the barracks and had to use the communal latrines. There were no doors, so that 20 men had to sit side by side as if they were on a train. But all that has gone. And what we find in the first probably, I would say, third of the book. The author is stating the awful things that they have to do as the story unfolds, but cutting back in like snippets of memory to when they were at school and they were leaving and they had to go through the training and the barracks. And there's a character called Himmelstoss who is a corporal, a little martinet, a little tyrant who is forced to come and join them at the front. And it's just so well done. I have no idea what it's like to be in the army. I served in the Royal Navy. But there's similarities. We all have to go through basic training and do marching and all that yomping in the wild points and assault courses and all that, learning to fire a weapon. But nothing like what the army would do. And of course, the way in which the army is structured at the front is not necessarily what I would recognise, but I could kind of imagine what it would have been like. And there's this blaseness with the camaraderie of the men, and that comes across in the book. And he says here, a soldier is on much closer terms with his stomach and digestive system than anyone else is. 3/4 of his vocabulary comes from this area. I can appreciate that. When you're young and in the forces, like I was a young man. I joined at 16. I was on my first ship by the time I was 18, 17 actually. And you quickly fall into the way that the lifestyle is, and you think of the food. You go from one meal to the next, and they feed you well. But we had what's called the heads, the toilets on the ship. But for the soldiers, it's latrine. And because they are hanging around the latrines, latrine rumour, a phrase, has come to mean all kinds of gossip, because that's where they're hanging out. So he sets the scene very well. The camp, the front, the awful things they have to come across. There's this one scene where they get shelled. I think I may have mentioned this before in a previous episode. And to get away with it, they have to go into where people are already buried, coffins. And if they survive, they come out, and he does. There's so much noise ringing in the ears, they begin to realise there's this screaming. Where's it coming from? And it's the horses. One's had its back broken, and it's literally going around in circles and so on. You can just imagine what these young men would have gone through. Because Louis Remarque actually did go through this war. And in fact, just as an aside, what's an amazing thing about him? He published a book in 1929. He was exiled from Nazi Germany and deprived of his citizenship, probably because he painted a picture the Nazis did not want people to know about. But this is a part I wanted to talk about, the loss of innocence. And I don't think, unless you're reading a novel, a lot of history books tends to focus on certain aspects, but not really the morale of people or this sense of loss of innocence, mainly in the books I've read. First World War, Second World War. It's very refreshing, although not in a good way, to actually get a first-eye or first-hand account of the war. And that's what he does. And it's about these young men have left school. He says here, Kantorek was the form master at school, and he pictures what he was like, short, and this shortness is going to link later. A strict man. And I remember in the movie with John Boy, I forget the actor's name, but the superb actor, English actor, Donald Pleasance played this form tutor. And then there was Corporal Himmelstoss, the terror of Klosterberg Barracks. He was short. He said, it's funny how often the miseries of this world are caused by short people. I'm 5'8". They are so much more quick-tempered and difficult to get on with than all tall ones. I've always tried to avoid landing up in companies with commanders who are short. Usually they are complete bastards. Sorry. But there was this sensibility before the war of, it'll be over by Christmas, you've got to go to war, you're a coward if you don't. Well, he talks about that, he writes about it. He said one of our class was reluctant, Joseph Boehm. He let himself be persuaded because he would have made things impossible for himself by not going. Even our parents used the word coward at the drop of a hat. People simply didn't have the slightest idea of what was coming. No one did. And there they are, or there they were, marching off to war, believing they're going to come back as conquering heroes, and literally a whole generation of Europeans and beyond almost wiped out. There were thousands of Cantorex, he writes, all of them convinced that they were acting for the best, in the way that was the most comfortable for themselves. But as far as we are concerned, that is the very root of their moral bankruptcy. And you can see why that didn't go down with the Nazis, who eulogized and made war seem a glorious pursuit. Just beautifully written. It's very matter of fact, often slightly stream of consciousness. And what he does, he mixes these little bittersweet scenes with outright horror, and then quiet, and then noise, and I guess that's a sign of all great writers. But it's this loss of innocence, this loss of a world. We believed in them. This is the school teachers and the professors and the parents before the war. In our minds, they had the idea of authority, implied deeper insights and a more humane wisdom. But the first dead man that we saw shattered this conviction. We were forced to recognize that our generation was more honorable than theirs. The conflict between those who were forced to go to war, conscription, although a lot of them volunteered, otherwise they would have been given the white feather in Britain and called a coward and not a man. And within weeks, all that innocence had gone. And it was never to be returned, certainly in Germany. The view of life that their teaching had given us fell to pieces under that first bombardment. While they went on writing and making speeches, that's them, back at home, we, the soldiers, saw field hospitals and men dying, while they preached the service of the state as the greatest thing. We already knew that the fear of death is even greater. Our eyes had been opened, and we saw that there was nothing left of their world. And then he goes on to explain how one of their mates in the company is in hospital, and eventually all they want is his boots, because they know he's going to die. Wonderful little statement here. He's called Kemmerich, and the author goes in. Kemmerich no longer has a foot. His leg has been amputated. He looks terrible, yellow and pallid, and his face already has those weird lines. There is no longer any life pulsing under his skin. Death is already in his eyes. And he remembers the scene when they were leaving his home, and his mother begged the author to look after this lad, because he was young and he's not going to make it. And there's this sense of guilt, because he says, how can you keep an eye on someone on a battlefield? And of course it wouldn't have been the Germans, it would have been the Italians, because I'm also reading at the moment A Farewell to Arms, which is Hemingway, but that's on the Italian front. And it would have been the same when you read Graves, is it Robert Graves, Rupert Graves, can I remember? Goodbye to All That, when he talks about his time at the front and growing up. Everyone felt it. This cataclysmic event that forced everybody to confront their mortality and the death of others in a quick amount of time. And he talks about 20-year-olds being cut off with no roots. And I felt this when I was in the Navy. So there was one point in the mid-80s, I was on one ship, and we was out in the Indian Ocean. And it wasn't long after Chernobyl. And there was this palpable sense of being dislocated. Well, I felt it. I don't know about others, but I did. Palpable sense of being dislocated from reality. Middle of the ocean, I knew where we were because my place of work was on the bridge, so I got to see all the charts. Most people on board wouldn't have known where we were. And we knew things were tense, very tense. It was the height of the Cold War. And I thought I wasn't going to go home. I wasn't going to get to see home again. Something potentially may happen and I will end my life somewhere in the ocean, because it got very tense. And that was like cut adrift from everything. Well, when you're in a war zone and potentially you could be dead the next day, it would have been a weird feeling. He said, when we came out here, we were cut off from everything we had done up to that point. The older men, and these are the people either in the army or at home, they still have firm ties to their earlier lives. They had property, wives, children, jobs, interests, bonds so strong that the war can't break them. But for us, 20-year-olds, there are only our parents, and for some of us, a girlfriend. We really didn't have much else. A few hobbies, school, and now nothing is left of it at all. We had been standing on the very threshold of life itself. We hadn't had a chance to put down any roots. The war swept us away. For the older men, the war is an interruption. I hadn't considered that before. Yeah, it was an interruption for some, but it was potentially the end for many, especially if you were young, because they had not set down any family or any ties to where they came from. Very interesting point of view. Our heads were full of nebulous ideas which cast an idealized, almost romantic glow over life and even the war. We had 10 weeks of basic training, and that changed us more radically than 10 years at school. Yeah, I can count for that. We learned that a polished tunic button is more important than a set of philosophy books. That intellect apparently wasn't the most important thing. It was the kit brush. Not ideas, but the system. Not freedom, but drill. We had joined up with enthusiasm and with goodwill, but they did everything to knock that out of us. Saluting, ice front, marching, presenting arms, right and left about, snapping to attention, insults and 1,000 varieties of bloody-mindedness. We were being trained to be heroes the way they trained circus horses. And through all of that, the best thing that the war produced was comradeship in arms. There was a guy I watched once on YouTube who was ex-US Army, and he runs a YouTube channel, but not BookTube. And he said, unless you've gone through the armed forces, you don't really know what it is like to have served alongside someone else. That you can not see each other for years, and when you do, if you come back together again, like I did with my mate Steve, after 35 years, it's as though you never departed each other. You met the day before. And that's difficult to convey into civilian life. If you've been in the forces, you know what I'm talking about. But if you haven't, you think, no, that's not right. But the final thing I hear about this loss of life, and it's not really itself a loss of life, but it sums up in a sense that I still remember my time in the forces through certain smells. WD-40 in Greece. He said, this smell of carbolic and gangrene clogs the lungs like thick, suffocating porridge. Brilliant book. I'm loving it. And I'm relishing taking it nice and slow. Well, pretty much now all the books I read. And there's so much more to talk about. And I so was tempted to just think, no, I can't keep doing 2 or 3 episodes by a little slim book like this. But that would do a disservice to the writing, because there's so much here to talk about. So much to seep in. We cannot fathom the world in which World War I happened. Although, just as a little aside, it wasn't the First World War. It was actually the second. The First World War, as Churchill said, was the 7 Years' War in the 1750s. Anyway, that's aside. In the Great War, 1914 to 1918. And again, random things are coming in. I do apologise. If you've ever seen Blackadder, Blackadder Goes Forth, that last scene when they go up and over the top So melancholy. There's this great line, Hugh Laurie said, the Great War, 1914 to 1917, because I think it's all over. We cannot fathom the loss and the dislocation it caused in Europe. We can only study how it did go. Mass slaughter on an industrial scale. It's just unbelievable. And what Remarque does, he humanizes the people in it, in that meat grinder. Not as a poem, not as an after report. It's as though you're there, and all the visceralness of it. So very good for that one reason. And it's definitely a recommended book because of the emotions it brings. Beautifully written. So I'm going to carry on reading this one, and I'll no doubt we'll do others later. So if you got this far, thank you very much. Ta-ta for now.